subconscious, intelligent end of racism that tactically works out what you can say. I mean, I'm not saying that anyone's actually going through this in their heads, but at any point in time, there'll be a certain kind of racism that's socially acceptable and other types that are not. And the one that they'll push on is the socially acceptable one. And I think it's interesting that Islamophobia, there's been a reverse on that in the past 10 years. If you go back 10, 12 years to the immediate aftermath of 9/11, liberal columnists like Polly Toynbee and Deborah Orr and people like that were saying, I'm proud to be an Islamophobe. And you know, they wouldn't say that now. After the EDL, after Breivik, you know, people have kind of worked out that the anti-Muslim thing is racist. I mean, every time there's been an Islamophobic outrage in recent weeks or recent years, there's been a counter-mobilisation. So when a mosque burns down, there's a vigil the next day, and it's reported in The Guardian. You know, this wasn't the case if you go back 5-6 years ago when the EDL first emerged. So, you know, there are points where particular kinds of racism and particular prejudices become cutting edges, and they're the ones that are driven forwards. But once you've got that kind of rent in the fabric, all the other bile comes through. He said, mixing his metaphors quite badly, but that's the kind of way I see it. So yeah, absolutely, if you let the anti-immigrant stuff go unchecked, all the other crap will come back. Absolutely. And you kind of see it in the way that, you know, the one kind of thing that the mainstream media does against UKIP that's sort of effective is, because UKIP have grown very massively and beyond their resources, you know, they just basically had to take on board anyone who's willing to stand as a councillor. Now, the problem is that something that Farage had been quite careful about controlling in previous years, which is making sure that people who are just insanely racist or have massive far-right records, you know, records in the fascist movement, don't get into UKIP. That quality control has gone. So, you know, it's very easy for the Daily Mail, for the Guardian or Hope Not Hate or whatever to seize on particular elements of UKIP council candidates saying something outrageous, and then it's all over the press, and Farage has to step in, either sack the person involved or reprimand them, or, you know, or we're not like that. But you do see that kind of that id upsurging every now and then especially amongst the kind of the rank and file of UKIP and rank and file Tories and their voter base, who don't get the sophistication of, you know, this is how we do racism, not like that. So yeah, the old and new are linked up in that way, and I do want to stress that I'm not saying that when I say these things are receded from the background, I'm not saying they're no longer a problem. What I'm saying is that that's not racism at its strongest, and we have to worry about racism at its strongest and defeat it there. Cultural versus economic arguments. Now, I think that this is really interesting, because one of the other shifts that's happened in the past 10 years is the rehabilitation of a certain kind of soft nationalism. You know, you started off with the bulldog in the Peter Mandelson bulldog in the New Labour advert, and then the New Labour's nationalism, New Labour's Britishness policy, and the whole discourse around British values, which of course has been accelerated under the Tories. And it is a kind of a rather peculiar and strange way of being racist but not being racist, you know, of saying, well, we don't like these people because they don't sign up to our values, but then being very nebulous as to what those values are. I mean, the only people who are explicit about what those values are is the sort of Michael Gove wing of the Tory party, and they say the British values are the free market. But of course, as soon as you put it as explicitly as that, then a lot of the people you're trying to pull in with this Rule Britannia stuff kind of, well, hang on, I don't necessarily think that is a British value. But what I think the economic stuff that you mentioned and the cultural stuff you mentioned, what they have in common is they're both mythologies. You know, the black group or the immigrant group or whoever it is that you're spreading this wibble about culture, that they're from a different culture to us, that's actually not true. It's not true that English people avoid showering, so that's a myth. It's a myth that's spread to generate fear. And I think that point about finding a scapegoat, generating fear, finding a channel where people's disgruntlement and anger and fear for themselves and for the future a sort of lightning rod for that, so to pull those impulses in a particular direction. I think that's very true. And of course the economic arguments are also mythologies, they aren't actually coming over here and stealing our jobs. That's not how it works. So what you point to as a distinction, the cultural style arguments and the economic style arguments, at the level of ideology, you can see how they link up, because they're two different ways of doing mythology. They're two different ways of doing fear. And that's why people like UKIP, if you like, Farage, will quite carefully dance back and forth between them. He will play to the fear that, Britain's not like how it used to be. There's this sense of the people, and again, the Revolt on the Right book goes into a lot of detail about the kind of people who are in the core target market for UKIP's message. And it's, very much they're playing to this kind of cultural nostalgia and this sense that it's not Britain anymore. But they also know that those kind of arguments, if you get too explicit about them, start becoming obviously racist. Actually what you're complaining about is black people, And so the economic arguments are the more respectable way of doing it. And he'll dance back and forth between the two, I think, in quite a clever way. We have to work out where to tripping that up, I think a lot of this, in terms of how we lay a finger on UKIP, is about spotting where their own contradictions lie and working out how we can get at them. I thought it was interesting that Farage couldn't work out what to say about Scotland, because on the one hand he's got one foot in the establishment, so he's got to be unionist. On the other hand, he's meant to be anti-establishment, but he couldn't do that because the left had kind of quit the pitch, basically, north of the border. So it meant that he kind of scuttled up to Scotland, made a couple of token speeches, and then buggered off again. And just really didn't want to kind of go in there, which I thought was quite interesting. That kind of leads on to this question of the role of the state and the role of the anti-establishment thing. I think this is linked to a wider question about the role of the state under neoliberalism, because there was a point, if you look at the 60s and 70s, most of the demands of the anti-racist movement were for, say, protective legislation from the state, and it's the kind of sort of Labour reformist notion of the state as a benevolent welfare provider, and of course, that I think is increasingly disappearing, and now you're seeing instead the state with its teeth bared, the state as an authoritarian instrument is coming to the fore. And you kind of see a bit of that with the business about the NHS and the way that frontline NHS workers are being turned into immigration cops. And people don't like this, They might on the one hand say, well, it's a problem that the resources are being strained by all these immigrants coming in. But on the other hand, they don't like the fact that, you see this very, very clearly with the benefits system. The benefit system is now set up to be this obstacle course, hoops and things that you have to jump through. I recently tried booking a doctor's appointment for insomnia. And it was really difficult because of the metrics and the league tables. You have to phone up on the dot at 8:30 in the morning and book an emergency appointment. Otherwise, you have to wait a month because of the 48 hours. And of course, if what you're suffering from is insomnia, this is really difficult, yeah. So it took me like 3 days until I was kind of awakened up at 8:30 to be able to do this. And just realising that this is how GPs work. You know, the reception staff are there to set ill people against each other so that they scrap amongst themselves so that a few can then get the appointments, which is a kind of an insane way of running this, but that's how it's being pushed. So I think that notion that somehow kind of turning the argument on the state is an important one. I think it's a difficult one for a trade union to do. I think it's the sort of thing revolutionaries can talk about, you know? We can talk about this is what the state is really about. But it's an argument that even the social democratic left will become uncomfortable with it because it has an investiture in the illusions of the sort of, you know, benevolent welfare state and the sustainability of that, or at least the memory of that. But of course there is a further complication here, which is that large chunks of state spending are for welfare. So I think actually underlying all of these arguments about racism and sexism is a question of reproduction and social reproduction, and the crisis of social reproduction, the crisis of the mechanisms to actually kind of create a working class and keep it clothed and fed and well. And those are kind of beginning to creak and fall apart. One of the things we need immigrants because there aren't enough native, you know, the birth rate has dropped below the replacement level, which is what happens as soon as you give women the access to birth control and basic stuff like that within 2 generations. And you're seeing this pattern actually happening around the globe, you know, even in places that you wouldn't think of as particularly progressive on women's rights. So now the other aspect of the issue of the role of the state and how to get an anti-establishment edge to this, which I think is much more problematic, is the issue of political correctness, and especially over Rotherham, because Rotherham and Rochdale, because you do have a problem with the complicity of the Labour Party in these abuse scandals, and a specific way that the limited anti-racist policies that have been won have been used very cynically as an excuse for, you know, why didn't you listen to these? Why won't we listen to these mostly white girls in Rotherham? Oh well, you know, it's equal opportunity. We can't do anything about it. You know, and you can see the way that this has been wheeled out by managers as an excuse. You know, oh, my hands were tied by political correctness. And if you read the report, that's the kind. You know, the police, for instance, put a great deal of stress on this is why nothing was done about it. And so this creates a sort of situation where it's in the interest of the council management to talk up the notion that it was PC gone mad, and of course it's in the interest of the right to talk up that as the excuse. And it creates a situation where UKIP can just, you know, drive a coach and horses through this. I don't really know how we can deal with that effectively. I mean, obviously there's some basic anti-racist stuff that the left was saying, that this wasn't about political correctness, it was about sexism, it was about vulnerable not being listened to. But I can see, especially as things like the kind of corporate diversity policies become a sort of visible end of what the big bourgeoisie is doing, and the thing is, people's kind of suspicions towards the big bourgeoisie at that point resonate with a popular racism, so it opens the door to a kind of right-wing attack on that. What I think the left needs is a way of talking about bureaucratic anti-racism that doesn't concede the language of political correctness, because I think that's just toxic. I don't think we can adopt that for our purposes. That doesn't simply dismiss those kind of, you know, multicultural policies as useless. I think that was a mistake that the far left made in the 80s of just saying, oh, it's all Saris and Somozas, and not actually understanding that it's you know, I would rather that, you know, there's a multi-faith group that the council has to go and talk to. I'd rather that they were doing that kind of bureaucracy than like just talking to the vicar, which is what they would previously have done. But we need to somehow clarify that, and I'm increasingly kind of seeing that as a problem. I think, especially with and the way that the left has been implicated in some of the scandals around sexual abuse, and the way that the left's theory on this, I think, has been needs to get up to scratch. It means it's harder for us to kind of really come in there and make a clear statement about what's going on in places like Rotherham and Rochdale. These are very tentative notions at the moment. I wouldn't put a huge, you know, there's the obvious things we need to do to counter that kind of wave of reactions that are coming in our direction. But there's a reason why UKIP are playing the PC card in Rochdale, and there's a reason why Labour are responding to it by just remaining completely silent. You know, I don't think any of those things are coincidences. And I am kind of worried about what you're saying about Labour doing the cynical thing of talking up its supporters, because I can see a situation that the rise of UKIP in the short term is going to, you know, put a spoke in the works of the right. It's probably going to mean that there's going to be a Labour government. It's probably going to screw up the Tories in a lot of constituencies, you know, split their vote and let Labour in. But that's, in the short term, might be of opportunist benefit to Labour, but in the medium and long term, there's going to be a big problem. And just look at what happened with Hollande. Hollande won in France by default, not because he was particularly inspiring, not because everyone hated Sarkozy. And now you're seeing Marine Le Pen kind of, you know, essentially driving this forwards. And if the attack on UKIP is just done in this kind of opportunist prop up the Labour Party way, I can see like a Labour Party government getting elected, the Labour movement going, phew, got away with that, going back to its bad old ways, and suddenly it all coming back, you know, just far, far, far worse. So, you know, those are things that I think we need to worry about. Finally, the racism of the ruling class, what's going on there. I think this is a really interesting question, and there's a much wider question of what is ruling class subjectivity, what is bourgeois subjectivity these days? Does the, you know, in like the 1800s, they put railroads across America. That's what, you know, the ruling class had this vision, it could go and do this, and it went and did this. Could it even do that now? I mean, the ruling class realises that, like, there's a problem with climate change, but could it even actually, you know, get its finger out? I think that, in a sense, the contradictions of capitalism starts to mess with their own heads. That they themselves are quite fragmented. You know, the ones who've got a sort of vision don't have enough traction to actually push that through. The fact that really their system is still in crisis, you know, they've patched it up from 2007, 2008. There's no consensus on what actually the issue is. Actually, the debt bubble's been pushed into other areas. A lot of people are saying, you know, there could be a property bubble in China could explode. There could be another, there could be another financial crisis. You know, I'm not saying these things are going to happen, but I get the impression of a very brittle, very fragmented ruling class that is getting away with things because 25 years ago it smashed the working class, so it doesn't have the working class breathing down its necks, but it doesn't really know what to do. So I think that's reflected in the kind of the way it. You know, I don't think it is. I mean, there are rare examples of where it's conscious, like, you know, I think Ford organised a production line so that different people from different languages were next to each other to stop the workers. That's a classic example of a very conscious divide the working class thing. But I don't think dividing the working class is ever, the primary motive for what they do. What it is because an epiphenomenon of racism is dividing the working class. It ends up being in ruling class interests. So they end up kind of going in that direction. But the ideology follows its own logic. The role of nationalist and racist ideology in terms of cementing the right as a political force, I think, is really important for them. I mean, it was only when I went to Cambridge and met proper ruling class people for the first time that I realised that they actually believe this stuff about the Queen and the Union and all of that stuff. It really matters to them. The military, it really matters. You have to get people to die for Queen and country. This is why I think Cameron is toast in Tory circles, because to have gambled with the Union over the Scottish referendum like that, and to have got 45-55 is too close. And so although that kind of mythology really matters on the right, and I think that's one of the key reasons why it always turns. But it's not a consistent thing. You get Tory anti-racists, people like Peter Osborne, the Telegraph journalist, who was actually very passionate about speaking out against Islamophobia, before it was trendy to do so. So there are all sorts of odd contradictions, but in the main, because racism serves as dual interests of weakening the working class and cementing their side, and I think both ones are important, they will always end up returning to that well and sucking from it. And that's the kind of way I see it. I've ribbled on for too long, but look, these are all, I don't claim any of these theories that I've put forward are necessarily answers, but I think the problems that we're looking at are real, and that the limits of a way that we've talked about racism, thought about racism for the past 20, 30 years, I think, I do think things are changing. And the fact that we're having problems, working out how to really land a killer blow on UKIP are symptoms of that. And we have a lot of work to do, both, on the small circles of the revolutionary left and as activists in the wider socialist movement to try to crack this nut over the months and years to come.